1 hour, okay. That's
Have
not much
1
time,
hour.
but we will do the best we can. So. All right, great to see you,
You're on. Welcome,
glad
Leonard.
to be here with everybody, and thank you all for joining me in this little conversation we put together really quick, and so I'm glad that you all are here, and good to see some of my colleagues that I've studied with in the past and I'm studying with now. So great to be here. I want to begin with just a kind of a sense that there's a lot of people that are right now kind of talking about this whole issue of is there on the horizon some kind of a great awakening? That's how it's phrased by some. A new reformation is how other people are putting it. A revival is how some others. So I just kind of wanted us to have a little chat this morning about that and what that might mean and what do you think. I tried to be a little provocative and say, if it is true that there is something on the horizon, will it start in the church or in the world? And secondly, would it even take in the church as we know it, given the preoccupations and fixations of the church? So that's kind of the little handle I thought we would play with this morning as we look at this whole issue of a coming revival. Let me also give you a metaphor to begin with, and this is the word. I've coined this new word. I'm really liking it, so you're going to have to get used to my using it with you today. The word is metaphor, and this is it's a coming together of two words, narrative plus metaphor, and this is the language of the culture that we're in. This culture does not speak in words. Oh brother, we're going to have another test. This culture speaks in metaphors. And so part of the challenge is when we communicate is to learn to speak in the language of the culture that we're in. And so the language is a metaphoric one. And so I'm going to begin with a little metaphor. A couple of years ago, I was teaching at Oxford at Keble College one summer, and I brought my daughter with me, Soren. And part of the deal was that I would lecture, and then when we get off, we'd kind of do what she wanted to do. Well, immediately what she wanted to do was go to Harrods. I was not all that excited by the place she wants to go. So I said, okay, we'll go to Harrods, but first we're going to go to Westminster Cathedral. And I wanted to kind of introduce her to Anglicanism and that kind of thing. So we went to Westminster Cathedral first. It was on a Saturday, and the place was mobbed. And there was a little line, a little note that said, we are like 2 to 3 hours away from the front.
I think Len's facial expressions are
Okay.
communicative. Anything I can share with you at this point.
The buzzing is so bad is when the guy comes up and says, we're testing the fire alarm system. That really drives me crazy. So I said to my daughter, I said, well, I am not standing in line for 2 to 3 hours to get into Westminster Cathedral. Tomorrow, Sunday, let's come back here for worship. And so let's come back for a worship experience tomorrow, and maybe the lines won't be so crowded. So we went to Harrods and had a good time. Of course, she wanted to go to the chocolate bar, which is the big thing. And the next day we came to church, and the contrast could not have been sharper. Got a 2 or 3 hour wait to get into Westminster Cathedral on Saturday. On Sunday, there was nobody waiting. In fact, the ushers were so glad to see us But there were so few people there to go to church that they sat us in the choir loft because they didn't want to go into the major part of the sanctuary because there were so few people. So we worshiped in the choir loft where the choir would be singing. I counted at best 50 worshipers. I mean, regular attenders, not included the ushers. I counted about 50 people like myself who were bringing their kids and wanted to give them an experience of Westminster Cathedral. And then there were about 20 or 30 people that were kind of upset because they thought it could be a museum on Sunday too. And they didn't want to come to church, they wanted to go to a museum. As soon as the worship started, they were off and out and just treating the place as a museum. Now, there's two ways in which we can look at this. Okay, we can talk about the decline of Christianity in the West. Christianity is dying in the West, and that is just one little evidence of this. Is the Westminster Cathedral. This is the where the kings get crowned and they get married and buried, and you got an ongoing congregation of maybe 50 people at best. Or you can say, what an incredible moment to be alive. You got people, tens of thousands of people willing to wait in line for 2 to 3 hours to learn the story of Westminster Cathedral. To be in relationship with people who were buried there. People who will pay money. I mean, Westminster Cathedral is making 20,000, 30,000 pounds a week just from people willing to pay money to go into that place. So you can either do as I was playing with my Facebook page this morning, the glory or the gloom scenario here. And I'm preferring the glory. I think that if we learn to communicate in the language of this culture, instead of trying to speak in words in which nobody can hear, and the church is still fixated on these words, but begin to speak in a language that they want, I think there's going to be a huge receptivity and an openness and an excitement about learning the greatest story ever told. The problem is it's become the greatest story never told or half told. So let me just begin with that. Any comments, questions as we continue? You can do the glory or the gloom scenario and about the world in which we live. A postmodern, I'd call it a TGIF, Twitter, Google, iPhone, Facebook world. So let me just step back for a moment and see if anybody wants to comment before we go any further. This will give me a chance to get some St. Arbucks here. Yeah. Nobody wants to talk to me? You just want me to keep talking? Okay. Hey, there's somebody typing something here about you. Maybe not. So what's the Saturday story? I don't get it. Okay. The Saturday story was that you had... Oh, I'm sorry. So the sound is garbled. Can you not hear me well, Josephine? Is there a problem in hearing me?
You're just fine. I haven't heard that from anybody else, so we'll just see if anyone else has that difficulty. It may be that I don't know what kind of connection you're using, James, but sometimes wireless...
The Saturday story is that you had
sound garbled, as you said.
A 2 to 3 hour wait to get into Westminster Cathedral, with people paying money and waiting in line to get into there to treat it as a museum. The Sunday story is that Westminster Cathedral is 6 days a week. It's a museum. 1 day a week, it's a worshiping community. You had nobody in line for it to be a worshiping community. You had huge lines for it to be a museum. Better. Is that a better sound now? Um, okay, good. All right. Okay. Um, okay. How does it become a helpful story? Well, you got people wanting to pay to learn the story of Westminster Cathedral. Um, and but they're not willing to worship in as they have, you know, as they associate with traditional kind of Anglican worship. So I mean, I think it's very encouraging. I don't think it's so much that they want to be entertained, Angela. Um, I think they want to learn the stories, and we got to find a way to tell them the stories in a way in which they can receive these stories. And they can't receive these stories in words anymore. Words do not communicate. It's images, it's metaphors, it's narratives, or that's why I see narrafor. They want the narrafor. And actually, the museum guides are better at giving them the narrafors than we are even in the church. Um, um, yeah, and we got to find a way to communicate these incredible images, sounds, and smells in a way in which they can receive it, and that's where the glory is. That's where I think the excitement is, Eddie, precisely there. The other thing that came, um, the other thing that came. No, the tour of a museum becomes that's their way of accessing the stories, and they don't want. Um, they don't want just more information. We're drowning in an avalanche of information. People want stories by which to build an identity, and that's what creates an identity. Are these stories? Um, but the problem that we have is that before you can be a storyteller, which is what it means to communicate in the language of the culture we're in, you got to be a story catcher. And I know even preachers that can stare a story in the face and not catch it as a story. It's just a bunch of words to them. So we got to train each other. We got to come to a way of understanding how to snatch and catch a story when we see it. The other thing that happened on this little trip, which also reminded me how vulnerable we are, both to missing the revival and to participating in it, is that when we walked into Harrods, the first thing that we saw as we walked in was the Princess Diana statue, where she and Dodi Fayed are kind of doing this dance, and she's releasing the dove. And I said to my daughter, who at the time was like 12 or something, she's 16 now, but I said to her, I said, Soren, you gotta get an image of this, because this is what people think of when they think of Princess Diana. They don't think of her memorial at where she's actually buried. They think of this statue right here. So as we go up the escalator, be sure and catch up an image of this. And she looked at me and said, who's Princess Diana? And my first reaction was to get mad, to get upset at her, because she did not know who Princess Diana was. I said, well, Soren, because it was like a personal insult to me, because we have an educated home and I have books. And I said, Soren, I got a book by Julie Burchill comparing Princess Diana and Marilyn Monroe. Remember I showed you that? And I told her right where the book was, and she had no idea who Princess Diana was. And I thought how quick it is for us to lose the story. We're just one generation away from losing the story. And we have been, not only are we in danger of losing the story in the church, but we've been we're going to lose the whole story in the culture as well. We cannot capture it ourselves for these kids. And I'd not made it intentional or purposeful to tell the story of Princess Diana to my daughter. It wasn't on my priority list. But we're not telling the stories, and we're not passing on the stories to succeeding generations. So we've got to find ways to pass on the story to them in a way in which they can receive it. And they cannot receive it through verses, Bible memorization, words. They've got to receive it in the language of their culture, which is a Neraphoric one. So that's the other conviction I have as to whether we will even be able to participate in this revival if we're so fixated on our little chapter and verse expository stuff. And don't realize that we got to sit at the feet of the greatest, as you put it, Angela, the greatest storyteller who ever lived, and that is Jesus, the master storyteller in the history of the world. Just even if you're not a Christian, you marvel at Jesus' storytelling abilities. So it's time for us to relearn the Jesus method of communication for this culture. Now, just a couple of things about this revival that I could feel in the distance. And one is that I think this is a culture, and it's hard for us to see this, but this is a culture that the more Facebook it becomes, the more hungry we are for relationships, and the more face-to-face we need. And we're seeing this all over. People want to neighbor again. They want to village again. They want a small town again. They want to have relationships again. They want to live their life with other people again. And so there's a huge hunger for community, and it's not it's both and here. It's a well curve world, not a bell curve world, and that's a huge shift. The well curve, not bell curve. So you have opposite things happening at the same time that are not contradictory. And one of the things is the more digital and electronic we become, the more the relational hungers there are. And the real Hunger Games phenomenon is all about what is the real hunger at the human heart. And it's also a world where kids are not seeing the fact that they are appreciated or even wanted or valued. They're expendable. And that's a whole other conversation. So we got this huge hunger for relationship and community, and there's not been one mall that has opened up in the past 8 years that has faced outward. Every single mall that has opened up in North America in the past 8 years, has faced inward. Every single mall has faced outward and tried to create a village feel. The malls that face inward, that are parking lot malls, that you go to them, you park as close as you can, you go inside, and everything is protected inside. Those malls are now senior citizen centers, or they're closed, or they're selling to churches. The only malls that are opening up are malls that create a village feel, a small town feel, outdoors malls, pedestrian malls, not parking lot malls. And so there's a real hunger for relationship, for community, even for sometimes the feeling of fake community, which is what these malls. But some of these malls they're actually people are moving in. They're condos and sometimes even houses, but they aren't built for cars. They're built for people, and this is a massive shift, and it ought to be good news to the church because the future is not parking lot church. The future is pedestrian church. All right, how about some concrete suggestions of how to bring in the sense of community to tell the story? And I'd say a little more about the well curve. And this is the guy who created this. If you just look up Daniel Pink, he's the one that coined the well curve. And we're used to thinking bell curve, where things bunch up into big middles. It's called a normal distribution curve. And in a bell curve world, which the modern world Gutenberg was, everything massified into these huge middles. So you had a huge middle class, middle management, everybody tried to think middle, think mass, think general. How many companies do you know that are named General? General Electric, General Motors, General Foods, General Mills, General Dynamics, General. So in that kind of a world, the best place is to position yourself in the middle. In a well curve world, the middle, see, a well curve has strong ends and the middles all flatten out, drop out. So there's this huge mitosis of the middle now, where the ends, the opposite ends are becoming huge, and the middles are bottoming out. So the church is still struggling to hold on to the middle when opposite things are happening at the same time. The ends are getting huge, and there's very little middle. So the only way you operate in that world is you don't hug to the middle. You build the bridges between the extremes. I just say build a bridge and get over it. And that's the difference here. So in a Facebook world, you have more face-to-face. How do you bring Facebook and face-to-face together? Television screens are getting, any screens are getting bigger and screens are getting smaller. Nobody wants a middle-sized screen anymore. The world's getting more global, and the world is getting more local, more tribal. So in that kind of a world, the most important thing you can do is to do your local well, to really tribalize your story. And that's where, to bring in the sense of community to tell the story, is I think is so key, is we've got to learn. And let me give you a metaphor for this. Jesus cried twice. He cried once over a person and once over a place. Now, he probably cried a lot more than that, but at least from a biblical standpoint, he cried twice. In other words, Jesus loved a person so much, he cried over him. And Jesus loved a place so much, he cried over that place. Jesus cried over a best friend. He cried over a favorite place. In other words, I don't know what you have in Canada, but in the U.S. we have something called zip codes. Do you have postal codes? What you have, we have a zip code here, or maybe you have some kind of postal code. It has those 6 numbers, I think it is. But Jesus cried over a zip code or a postal code enough. He loved the zip code. He loved the postal code enough to cry over it. And I think the question of whether we're going to be a part of this revival that's coming or not is, do you love your postal code enough to cry over it? Do you even know your postal code enough to cry over it? Are we doing postal code ministries? Are we actually creating what I call campfire stories that are generated by that postal code, that identify who we are and give a signature story of what our identity is in that postal code? And then from that particularity of your postal code, you then universalize, and you'll have global resonance. But this is not how we did ministry in a bell curve world. In a bell curve world, we looked at somebody else's, like a Rick Warren or a Bill Hybels, who were doing postal code or zip code ministries in their spot. We go, well, I like what you're doing, so I'll try and do your zip code in my postal code. And that's not going to work. And that's not what's going to meet the hungers of the human heart for this TGIF culture. People want authentic, real, local. One of the biggest words, and it became the word of the year a couple of years ago, was the word locavore. And what it means is that you eat basically within a 50-mile radius of food that's grown within a 50-mile radius of where you are. The Girl Scouts now even have a locavore badge. You can get a locavore app. But we've got to learn to appreciate the power of this word locavore. The glory of the local church is, first of all, that it's local before it becomes global. In fact, you particularize in order to universalize. Do the particular well. And that's the key. A locavore ministry, locavore church. your well curve has two ends that are occupied. It seems like the large congregations like a Lawrence is a place on the well curve as well as the local on the other end. There will be, I think the megachurch has got to reinvent itself or it's going to be in trouble. I mean, we're already seeing massive defaults and foreclosures of megachurches that have been built in the past 20 years. Megachurches, to the extent to which they inhabit a suburban mindset and a franchise mindset, are, I think, in trouble. And there will be, I think, the extent to which megachurches go into a multi-site format, a more satellite church format, where you have, you can do the local with a local pastor, somebody who can really localize that celebrity preacher, if you will. I think that will bring those two together. But I think we are in real, I think the megachurch as a All right, I'm back. They stopped yelling at me. Not everybody. They're just buzzing as crazy. By local, small, I'm talking 150 to 300. And I think that's where I think we've got to rediscover what all that 150, but what the power of a small church and the unique capacity of a small church to foster community. So I think we're in for a real celebration of smallness again. Do little large is the kind of mantra, I think, of this world that is a well curve. I call it the well curve mantra: is do little large. Do little well, and then do it in a large way. So I think it's great. This is a great time for the small membership church. I think this is an exciting time for the small membership. If we will do small well, not do large little, but do little large. And a lot of pastors are trying to do large little. I'm saying no, do little large. Start at the particular and then go to the universal. Start at the local and then go to the globe. So that's the same thing. Just do micro, macro, and I think if you look at where do people want to live and where are they actually now trying to move to, nobody wants to live in suburbia anymore. The number one places people want to live are small towns and rural areas. And then secondly, urban. And so the three hot places to live are the places that weren't hot in a bell curve world. Everybody wanted to go to suburbia. There are, and let me back up here about what this means. Missio Dei means the mission of God. So it's theologically incorrect ever to talk about the church's mission, because it's not the church's mission, it's God's mission. The question is God's mission going to have a church? And God will not be without a witness. God will be in this future. And God will be reaching people even if God's anointed and appointed instruments decide to go off on their own on a mission that has nothing to do with God's mission. And that's why the whole history of the scriptures is what happens when God's anointed, appointed instruments decide to, be off on their own mission. And so you have, God saying, okay, you don't want to be a part of my mission. I'm not going to go stop being in mission in the world. So then that's when I think God just starts to have a little fun. God chooses pagan Persian kings like Cyrus. God chooses prostitutes like Rahab. God chooses rock singers like Bono. God will use whomever God wants to, so that God's mission in the world will be fulfilled. So there are times, and this is hard for us to hear, but there are times when God is actually more active in the world than in the church. And people throughout history of Christianity have lived in times where God is more active in the world than in the church. And I think the question for us is, are we maybe living in a time, or will this revival be such a time, when God will be more active in the world than in the church? I think there's a huge witness. Now, for me, Hunger Games. I don't know how many of you have seen Hunger Games, but it's really, as far as I can tell, it's really a chick flick. But and it's really captured my daughter, like few things have. But it's a way of God speaking to this culture, telling us some things, getting through to us some things. It used to be the churches used to be the ones that were confronting culture with the voice of God and with the witness of the Spirit and moving and critiquing the culture. Instead, now we've got even things like movies that are being, I think, can be powerfully used of God to speak to a culture and to say, is this really where you want to go? Is this really the future you want for yourself? So even in the whole Hunger Games phenomenon, and what do you really hunger for? What do you hunger for? Are your desires my desires? Are your desires your own consumeristic celebrity desires? And I don't know anybody can read these novels and see this movie without being indicted and feeling, is this really the direction that we wish to go? And that's exactly right. In fact, the best way to read the Bible is as a movie. You start from Genesis to Revelation, it's one movie. And for us to present the Bible as one movie, one continuous story, one story, and it's the story that has one major character, and that is Jesus the Christ. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Eddie. Doing is for us to particularize, to realize that we can make, the smallest things can make a world of difference. Let's learn to speak the language of the culture. Let's be the church that God made us. And let's be open to the way in which the culture, God can speak through this culture to say things to us. That are we hungering for the right things? Is the church hungering for the celebrity, entertainment that you found in that same Hunger Game expose, if you will? So I think that's a great way of summarizing what we've talked about so far. Anyone else want to get in here with anything, or before I keep going? Let me see.
There were a few questions further back, Len. There's one from Maria that was quite long. Were you able to read that one at all? Tribalizing. One of the 70-somethings in my denomination recently was published complaining that we, quote, are saying that Jesus' work is just a good story, end quote. There's so much generational translation to do to try to explain that that's not what we're saying. As we engage the new generations with the story, how do we deal with the naysayers to our methods if they aren't open to our explanations of what
that's a really good. There's so much there in that one question. I don't know where to start, but let me say, first of all, I don't think it's a generational issue.
Is that part of tribalizing?
I think the divide.
Generational disconnect?
I think the divide is more a psychographic one than a demographic one. I know some people in their 70s and 80s that are more what I call TGIF, Twitter, Google, iPhone, Facebook, than people in their 20s and 30s. So I don't think it's, at root, it's a generational or a age one, a demographic one. I think it's a psychographic one. Where's your spirit? And if you are in mission, I mean, the first thing a missionary does is learn the language of the culture. I'm sorry. And if you're in mission, you are going to want to learn the language of the culture that you're in. So I find a lot of people, 60s, 70s, even 80s, that are in mission, that are wanting to talk to their grandchildren, talk to other people, talk to the culture. And so they are, their spirit is such that this is not an issue for them. So I don't think it's a generational one. I do think that that there comes a time when you're always going to have, and I hate to put it like this, but here's the metaphor is barking dogs. And the dogs are always going to bark. They're always going to nip at the heels. They're always going to complain and yell and scream. But you don't stop the wagon trains because the dogs are barking. The dogs bark and the wagon trains move on. And we just got to move on in mission and ministry. And we don't, because you're never going to go anywhere if you try and get the dogs to stop barking. There's always going to be people yelling and barking and carping and complaining. And if you worry about them, nobody's ever going to get anything done. So I just, you keep moving. And you just keep moving forward where God is leading us. I don't really, Maria, worry about that, about the barking dogs. They're always going to bark. And that's all some people. Now, you always can learn something from your critics. And so I don't want to say that they don't have anything to tell us. And so one of the challenges that I have is everybody who critiques me, and I got more hate sites than most, although not as many as some. But you got to judge yourself anymore on how many hate sites do you have. And Rick Warren wins that one, so we all defer to him. But you learn something from each hate site, from everybody that's barking at you and nipping at your heels and trying to rip you down. You try and say, what can I learn from this? And so you learn something from your critics. And there's also a sense that every one of us, we all have to eat crow every day. You don't get through a day without eating some crow, eating some stuff you don't want to eat. And it's good for the soul, it's good for your health to eat some dirt. Every day we're eating dirt. So I'm not just in this Pollyannish mood here. You learn from your critics. In many ways, you learn more from your critics than from your friends. We all have to eat dirt. We all have to eat crow. It's just part of everyday life. But you keep moving. You keep moving. And the problem is the church has not moved. I am not. Thank you for saying that, Angela. I appreciate that. I'm increasingly, reminded of the fact that it's not my mission. It's God's mission, and that God is calling us to be a part of. It's a gift to be a part of God's mission. We are all missionaries, and I think that's the fundamental reframing that's got to take place now. We have a ministry to the body, but we have a mission in the world. And we're training our kids, we're training each other to be missionary churches, missionary families, have missionary marriages, missionary kids, to really live out of this missionary mindset, that we can reach this world, not the world we wish we had, but the world we actually have. So that's a whole other big thing here that I think. I also have a word for this that might be helpful and it might not. I talk about artisan churches, and I relate it to artisanal cheeses. I don't know what's going on in Canada's in a renaissance right now. I mean, everywhere you look, economics, politics, The best poets are in Canada, the best novelists are in Canada, the best musicians are in Canada, and the best cheese is in Canada. I mean, Canada now is producing some of the best cheese in the world. But what makes the cheese so unique is that it reflects the area where it is produced. And they're called artisanal cheeses. And the artisanal cheese is a cheese that reflects uniqueness. It smells like it, it tastes like it, it has texture like it, of the people that produced it. And we need artisanal churches. Not franchise churches, and that are trying to do other people's ministry and just put it in here. So that's the other part of that particularity that I think is so important. That if we're going to participate in this revival, the future is all about authenticity and uniqueness of witness, and people want artisanal experiences. By the way, the hottest word in the food industry in the past 5 years has been artisan foods. You even now have artisan pizzas at Domino's. You go to Starbucks and you get artisan sandwiches. I don't know what's in Canada right now in terms of artisan foods, but you even got artisan potato chips. I'll bet you Tim Hortons somewhere has an artisan something, because everything now is moving to artisan. So we've got to understand the hunger of this culture for authentic, real experiences that are anchored and rooted in a locale, in a particularity, and we've got to operate out of that. Artisanal experiences, artisanal churches. Anyone else before I keep moving? So don't institutionalize, do tribalize and localize. And that's the way to the universal and the general. Another example here. Does everybody know Shane Claiborne? Everybody familiar with that? Shane Claiborne is the hottest speaker on college campuses today, whether it's secular or Christian or whatever. And this is hard for a megachurch mindset, a bell curve world, to understand. But Shane Claiborne has no numbers. He has no statistics. What he has is a story that's grounded in a locale. He's taken over a postal code, a zip code in Philadelphia. And he's done authentic ministry there in that zip code. And because of his authentic ministry in that zip code, that has resonance, he has been able to globalize. So Shane Claiborne, what is it? How many people are part of the Simple Way? 34? 35? And yet, he doesn't have 10,000, he doesn't have 20,000, he's got 35. And yet the resonance of that story, of the story of a ministry and a mission done incredibly well in one little block of a city called Philadelphia, has universal resonance. And that's said so well, Eddie, that they do precisely that. So for me, Shane Claiborne is kind of another narrator of the future. That the way to the global, the way is to get an authentic, real story of your own, and then be able to tell it in the language of the culture of which we're a part. Let me say one more thing too about. So we got just a few more minutes. I want to say something about communities of practice. I think this is going to be a huge issue as well, as to whether our churches can actually become communities of practice. One of the worst things that can happen to anybody is, any parent at least, any family, is when one of the kids comes home and says, I want to take up a musical instrument. And from that moment on, I guarantee you, your house will never be the same. Your household changes forever. And you just hold your breath, hoping that what they've decided they want to take up, that musical instrument, is not the drums. All right. And we had that experience right across from where we live on Orcas Island. The neighbor boy took up the drums about 10 years ago. And the last 10 years have not been easy. I mean, I don't know how his parents have done it, but I live way across the street, and many times I've never done it, but I wanted to call the police. I mean, forget about a sound ordinance. We're just, you're just, it's unbelievable, the sounds that are coming out of this, and you just can't escape it. You can't. We have a 14-year-old now. About 4 years ago, about when he was 10, he came home, and he said, I want to take up a musical instrument. I just hold my breath, oh, Lord have mercy, I hope it's not the drums. And he says the clarinet. And I just took this big sigh of relief, How bad can it be? It's bad. I mean, it's bad. I mean, you cannot believe, and we got a little tiny 2,000 square foot house, so there's nowhere to escape the sound. I mean, the sounds of him practicing his clarinet have talk about totally changing a household. I mean, you've heard sounds that you never thought you'd ever hear in your whole life. I mean, forget fingernails to a blackboard. And you put up with it, though. I mean, why do we put up with it? I say you can't take it anymore. You put up with it because you want your kid to get good at his instrument. And to get good at an instrument takes practice. What does Malcolm Gladwell say? It takes 10,000 hours to get good at anything. That's a lot of bad notes, bad phrasings, missed notes. I mean, but you do it because you love your kid and you want him to get good at his instrument. Now, I tell you this story, and it's a narrow form, because faith is a practice. And you don't get good at faith if you don't practice it. You don't just say, Jesus, come into my life, and suddenly you're good at it. You get it all right. You don't hit any bad notes. Your theology's perfect. You got every thing that you do is just perfect in every way. No. It takes practice to get good at your faith. Faith is a practice. And the question is, can our churches become communities of practice? Because right now they're communities of pretend perfection. We do not allow people to practice in our communities. We expect perfection. And the people that are going to come to Christ in this revival are going to want to practice together. They're going to want to come to church, to a community of practice where they can learn their instruments together. And by and large, can we create these kinds of communities of practice? Not as they are now, communities, what I call pretend perfection. Practice makes perfect. Now, practice also makes permanent. So when you hear somebody constantly, consistently missing a note and a bad phrase, and you know that piece of music, sisters and brothers, you are spiritual. If a brother or sister be overtaken in a fault, or a bad note, or some bad theology, or some bad actions, you who are spiritual, restore that person, but in a spirit of meekness, humility, gentleness. And I do that kind of with my son on his instrument. But it's time for us to reframe the body of Christ as a community of practice. And we've got to learn to put up with people who are practicing their instrument, who are going to hit some bad notes, some bad theology, some bad ways of thinking, and we got to love them anyway, just as we love our kids. So, and it does, you're exactly right. But that's what the church ought to be. So the church as communities practice, I think, is going to be a huge marker as to whether or not we're going to participate in this coming revival. These TGIF, this TGIF culture, people want to practice together. They want to practice their instruments together in community. We have now, so far, have said, you don't practice your instrument here. You keep it away from here until you can get it right, and then when you get it right and come here, then only perfect instruments, please. And we've got to rethink this whole issue of the church and what it really exists for. So let me just stop there. Any more comments, questions? I think that's exactly right, John. I call this a good church. Get out of doors church. Early Christianity, look at the Gospels. Everything happens outdoors, and we've turned everything happening indoors. And we've got to get good again. G-O-O-D, get out of doors church. And we got to find a way to get out of doors and to live our faith out of doors. So, thank you. That's exactly right. So true. But the new standard of excellence is not the performance; it's the participation. That's the new excellence. Is not performance, but participation. And that's another major shift. It's not how well did you perform, but how well and how much opportunity is there to participate. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right, Bob. So well said, Paul. To trust the Spirit, and see, people want an authentic sound, authenticity, and transparency are key. And the metaphor I have for it, I have developed it here, but it's not the Michael Jordan Retro 11 sneakers. That's the shoe of the future. It's Cinderella's slippers. That's the shoe of the future. It's not the Michael Jordan Retro 11. It's the Cinderella slippers that are transparent. They're small. You got to be light on your feet. They just ooze authenticity and totally transparent. Anyone else?
Well,
Great being with you. Thank you.
thank you very much, Len. If someone has a final question, they might want to type it in quickly, but we very much, I think I can speak on behalf of all of us here, appreciate your creative and imaginative way of framing our task in this coming revival affecting our society and the church. Just want to remind folks to fill out our feedback form if you have a chance to do that, and the link is at the bottom right of your screen, and it will be emailed to you as well. We do have another webinar scheduled this week. Normally we have one every week except for Holy Week, recognizing that probably many of our prospective participants will be quite busy, so you're welcome to check out the EDGE website for a list of upcoming webinars. The one on Thursday will be on community development